What if I told you the heartbeat of British music didn't start in London's clubs or Manchester's rock halls, but in a Kingston yard half a world away? Before the world knew punk, before hip-hop spoke truth to power, there was reggae, a sound born from struggle, rhythm, and rebellion. But how did this island rhythm become the soundtrack of Britain's soul? They came looking for a better life and brought with them a beat that would change a nation. Yet what happened next wasn't just cultural exchange, it was collision. Reggae in Britain became the voice of a generation that refused to be invisible. But behind the sound systems, the lovers' rock hits, and the smoke-filled dance halls lies a story of resistance, identity, and survival, one Britain was never quite ready to hear. Before UB40 topped charts, before two-tone bands filled arenas, there were unknown pioneers, Jamaican immigrants, spinning vinyl in basements, turning pain into rhythm and rhythm into power. They didn't just make songs, they rewired the sound of Britain itself. But every revolution has a cost, and reggae's British story is one of love and struggle, pride and betrayal. This is the untold story of Reggae Britannia, how an island sound reshaped an empire, and why its echoes still matter today. Let's rewind to where it all began. In 1950s Kingston, Jamaica, the air itself seemed to move to a rhythm. The streets were hot, loud, alive, sound systems blasting out the new heartbeat of a young nation finding its voice. At night, the bass rattled zinc fences, while lyrics carried messages far heavier than their melodies. But this wasn't just music, it was survival. A generation raised in post-colonial struggle had found its language, and that language was rhythm. In those years, the radio in Jamaica was still tuned to distant stations from America. You'd hear the latest rhythm and blues, maybe some doo-wop. But what the youth in Kingston wanted wasn't just to imitate, they wanted to own their sound. So they stripped American music down, rebuilt it with local instruments, and filled it with stories only they could tell. Out of ska's upbeat horns came rocksteady's slow sway. Out of rocksteady's soul came something deeper, something that could move the body and the conscience at the same time. They called it reggae. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Britain was changing too. The war was over, but its shadows lingered. The economy limped. Factories stood half empty, and the empire that once stretched across the world was shrinking fast. Britain needed workers. The Caribbean answered. Ships like the Empire Windrush brought thousands of Jamaicans to rebuild post-war Britain, to drive its buses, staff its hospitals, and keep its cities moving. Hold that sound in your head, the beat of Jamaica pulsing under Caribbean stars. Now add the cold air of London in the 1960s, the clash of accents at a bus stop. The smell of fried plantain drifting through the fog, the first Caribbean families settling in areas like Brixton, Handsworth, and St. Paul's. They arrived with suitcases and sound systems, wooden boxes that could turn any basement into a dance hall. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. These early sound systems weren't just parties. They were community centers, job boards, social networks, long before anyone used that term. When doors closed elsewhere, these dance halls opened wide. A turntable became a weapon against isolation. Music became home. By the late 1960s, the first British-born children of Jamaican immigrants were growing up in this mix of cultures. On the radio, they heard pop and rock, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, music that rarely sounded like them or spoke to their experience. But in their homes and on their streets, they heard something else: ska, blue beat, rocksteady, the sounds of their parents' homeland. It was only a matter of time before these two worlds collided. Here's the piece almost everyone misses again. Reggae didn't sneak into Britain. Britain invited it. England was one of the first places outside Jamaica to truly embrace this music. As Ken Booth later said, England is the first place that embraced Jamaican music. When Jamaican artists toured the UK, they found crowds hungry for something raw and real. It wasn't long before British musicians, black and white, started picking up on that rhythm, building their own versions, layering local grit onto island soul. But rewind to the early years before the BBC noticed, before record labels saw profit in the groove. Reggae in Britain was underground, literally. Basements, back rooms, churches converted into weekend clubs. Every speaker was homemade, every amplifier patched together by someone who learned electronics from trial and error. Every night was an act of creation and defiance. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, across town, the mainstream scene was safe, shiny, and mostly white. The radio was drunk on novelty hits and corporate pop. MTV hadn't arrived yet, but British pop culture was already packaged, polished, and sold back to the public. Reggae was the opposite of all that. It was grassroots. It was human. It was a voice for people Britain refused to hear. By the time anyone in the media cared enough to say the word reggae, the foundation had already been built. The migrants had done their work, not in studios or boardrooms, but in living rooms and community halls. What began as a few speakers on Kingston corners now echoed through the brick walls of Birmingham and Brixton. This was the setup, the world before the legend. A Britain still struggling to define itself, and a Jamaica that had already done so through sound. The ingredients were simple: one island's rhythm, another's restlessness, and a generation caught between both. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Before reggae became a genre, it was a gathering. A heartbeat shared between neighbors who refused to disappear, and that heartbeat was about to grow louder. Beat. Next, how that underground pulse would rise through Britain's streets, reshape its music, and turn a cultural import into a national anthem. London, 1975. The city hums with static, factories closing, strikes brewing, and whole neighborhoods balancing between hope and unrest. Britain feels like a pressure cooker. For the first generation of Caribbean kids born here, life sounds different. They speak in British slang, but dream in Jamaican rhythm. They're too British for Jamaica, too Jamaican for Britain, and that tension needed somewhere to live. One night it happened, a rented community hall in Hackney, patched together speakers and a crowd of kids who'd grown up on both Marley and Motown. The bass dropped. Not quite Jamaican, not quite British, but something new. The rhythm was softer, the vocals smoother, the lyrics closer to home. It wasn't roots reggae anymore, it was lovers rock, the sound of Black Britain falling in love and fighting to belong. Freeze the frame. Listen to that bass line one more time. Sweet, romantic, but under it all, a pulse of defiance. In a country that often treated them as outsiders, these artists made something warm, human, and unmistakably theirs. Janet Kay's Silly Games hit the charts, and suddenly Britain couldn't ignore them. The kids heard themselves on the radio, finally, and the sound systems that once shook basements now powered block parties and local clubs. But that wasn't the only spark. Across town, another scene was exploding. The punk movement, loud, angry, unapologetic, found an unlikely friend in reggae. Punk bands like The Clash and The Slits didn't just borrow the sound, they shared the stage. When The Clash covered Junior Murvin's Police and Thieves, it wasn't theft, it was tribute. The two worlds collided in sweaty clubs and smoky pubs, white punks and black reggae heads moshing to the same beat. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. It wasn't just about music, it was politics on wax. Britain in the late 70s was turbulent. Rising unemployment, race riots, far-right marches, and police crackdowns under the Suez law that targeted black youth. In that storm, reggae became the voice of the unheard. Linton Kwesi Johnson was writing poetry that hit like protest songs. Steel Pulse was shouting back at racism with guitars and drums. As Reggae Britannia later put it, British reggae wasn't a copy, it was a mirror. Every lyric reflected what was happening in the streets: anger, pride, fear, and resilience. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, the mainstream press didn't know what to do with it. To some critics, reggae was too political, too foreign, or just too much bass. But to the fans, that's exactly why it mattered. When you've been told to keep quiet, a deep bass line feels like freedom. Numbers don't tell it. The footage does. You can see it in the packed halls of Birmingham, in the homegrown record labels popping up from nowhere: Trojan, Greensleeves, Island. Small, independent outfits that gave local artists a chance when the majors wouldn't even listen. Those little labels became lifelines. They carried the movement from pirate radio to national airwaves, and then came the backlash. Police raids on clubs, politicians calling reggae dangerous, and sound systems accused of spreading rebellion. But here's the irony: every attempt to silence it only made it louder. By the early 80s, reggae wasn't just a subculture. It was a statement. It stood shoulder to shoulder with punk, ska, and the new wave of British youth. Hold that thought, because while reggae was lifting off in Britain's black communities, a new wave of mixed race and white musicians were jumping into the rhythm too. The two-tone movement, the Specials, the Selector, Madness, took reggae's heartbeat and mixed it with ska and punk energy. Their songs about unity and inequality hit national charts, turning protest into pop. For the first time, reggae wasn't just played in Brixton or Birmingham, it was blasting from BBC radio, reaching kids from Leeds to Liverpool. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Reggae in Britain didn't just bridge races, it bridged realities. It gave working-class white kids and black immigrants a shared rhythm when politics tried to divide them. At a time when headlines screamed conflict, dance floors preached connection. By the mid-'80s, British reggae had its own sound, its own stars, its own swagger. From the tenderness of lovers rock to the militancy of roots revival, the UK had taken the blueprint from Kingston and redrawn it in its own colors. The movement had risen from basements to the BBC, from pirate radio to chart toppers, but with every rise comes tension. As reggae's message spread, so did the question: could it stay real when it went mainstream? Could a voice of resistance survive fame? And that's where the story turns, because what began as a spark in London basements was about to face its biggest test, the fight to stay true, when the whole world started listening. By the mid-1970s, reggae in Britain had grown from backyard parties to a full-blown movement. What started as a sound carried across the Atlantic had now become a voice for a generation born in Britain but raised on Jamaican rhythm. These weren't outsiders anymore, they were locals with roots that ran two ways, and they were about to shake British music to its core. Here's the thing: reggae in Britain wasn't just about the songs, it was about image, attitude, and identity. On the streets of Brixton or Handsworth, young black Britons found something that told them who they were, a sound that said, "We belong here too." Parents called it rebellious. The media called it dangerous. But the youth called it home. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, across town, mainstream Britain was still obsessed with soft pop and punk anarchy. Punk had safety pins. Reggae had dreadlocks and militancy. Both scared the establishment for different reasons, and that's what made them powerful. Reggae wasn't just selling records, it was selling permission. Permission to stand tall, to wear colors proudly, to speak patois on British soil without apology. The myth engine kicked in fast. The Rasta colors, the knitted tams, the Ital food, the ganja smoke, the heavy bass echoing through council estates. For kids growing up in gray cities, this was Technicolor rebellion. But strip away the headlines and you find the craft, the real reason reggae still hits. Solo the bass for a second, hear that low rolling groove. That's the anchor. In Jamaican studios, engineers push the bass louder than anything else, making it not just heard, but felt. In British reggae, that tradition got even heavier. Bands like Aswad, Steel Pulse, and Mutumbi built their songs around that same heartbeat, but added their own twist. British grit, urban tension, and jazz-trained precision. Hold that sound in your head. Now add the drums, the one drop. Unlike rock, which hits on the one, reggae pulls the rhythm back. The snare drops on the third beat, leaving space where other genres would fill it. That offbeat shuffle makes your body sway before you realize it's happening. One studio trick you can't unhear after this, engineers would sometimes record drums through echo chambers built out of bathroom tiles or storage rooms, giving that ghostly rolling reverb you hear on so many classic tracks. It made the music feel alive, like it was breathing in real time. And then came the voices. In Jamaica, singers like Burning Spear and Big Youth brought the roots and fire. When they toured Britain, local artists watched closely, studying the phrasing, the call and response, the preacher-like delivery. Soon, British singers like Janet Kay, Carol Thompson, and Dennis Bovell began blending soul and lovers rock into the mix, a softer, melodic side of reggae that conquered British charts while keeping its roots intact. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Reggae didn't just influence music, it rewired British culture. Sound systems like Saxon, Josh Shaka, and Sir Coxsone weren't just mobile discos, they were cultural institutions. They created spaces where language, style, and sound evolved together. Those parties changed fashion, military jackets, Rasta scarves, Levi jeans cuffed just right. They changed language. British slang started to sound a lot more like patois. Even punk kids took notes. The Clash, for example, openly admitted reggae shaped their sound and politics. Police and Thieves, White Man and Hammersmith Palais. Those weren't accidents. They were love letters to the culture Britain had tried to ignore. Hold that thought, because radio was changing too. When the BBC refused to play reggae, pirate stations took over. From rooftops and warehouses, DJs blasted the music across London, keeping the culture alive and connected. They didn't wait for permission. They built their own frequencies. One more layer to the myth controversy. Politicians and tabloids painted reggae as violent, drug-fueled, even anti-British. But to the people living it, reggae wasn't about violence, it was about truth. Songs talked about unemployment, racism, and identity long before the mainstream dared to. It gave voice to the voiceless, rhythm to resistance. And yet, for all the headlines, it's the craftsmanship that still stands tall. Listen to how a song like Steel Pulse's Ku Klux Klan balances fury and elegance. The slick horn lines, the hypnotic bass, the way David Hines' voice trembles between prayer and protest, or how UB40's Food for Thought wraps political hunger in pop melody. Every choice was deliberate, every groove earned. Here's why copycats never quite felt right. Reggae isn't just a rhythm pattern, it's a feeling. You can mimic the sound, but unless you carry the weight of where it came from, the migration, the struggle, the pride, you'll miss its heartbeat. By the late 70s, reggae wasn't just influencing British music, it was British music, from punk to pop, from The Clash to The Police, from Lovers rock to dub. Its fingerprints were everywhere. And that's where the story deepens, because what started as a sound of resistance was now shaping the mainstream. Reggae had gone from underground to unavoidable, but the question remained, could it stay true to its roots? Once the world was listening, beat. Next, how reggae's spirit faced the pressures of fame, crossover, and commercialization. The sound was global now, but at what cost?
This video is sponsored by The Lore Store on Amazon, your one-stop shop for music lovers across reggae, rock, pop, and hip-hop. We built it for real listeners who don't want to dig through 1,000 listings to find the right gear. Inside the Lore Store, you'll find 5 aisles. VIP, top, battle-tested essentials. Headphones, turntables, speakers, gig-safe earplugs, smart speakers. Reggae Vibe, roots and lovers. Rock made easy. Automatic decks, warm bookshelf speakers, vinyl care. Rock Lore, classic rock must-haves. Open back cans, simple amps, living room concert vibes. Pop Lore, feel-good everyday setups, clean, clear speakers, easy streaming, nostalgia-friendly picks. Hip-hop must-haves, punchy bass without the muddle, closed-back headphones and living room systems that handle low-end, plus a rotating crate of old album vinyl if you're rebuilding a 60s-90s collection. Every product page tells you who it's for, 3 pros, 1 con, and why we picked it. So you can choose with confidence. Flying soon? Check. VIP for noise canceling that tames plane roar. Mostly listening at home? Try open-back headphones that let live albums breathe. Want instant gratification vinyl? Our fully automatic turntable is 1 button from silence to music, and the record cleaning kit knocks down crackle so the bass tightens up. Headed to shows? Grab high-fidelity earplugs, hands-free at home. Our smart speaker picks let you say, play 70s reggae or classic pop, and you're there. Deal alert! If you use the link in the description, you'll land on our curated picks with current best available Amazon pricing and active discounts where applicable. Prices change, so buy now to lock in today's deal. Tap the link in the description, pick your aisle, grab a favorite, and tell me which category you want me to build next. The Lore Store. Listen better, with gear that gets out of the way and lets the music live.
By the early 1980s, reggae in Britain had reached something close to glory. For a moment, it felt like the movement had cracked the code. Chart hits, packed festivals, homegrown stars. The sound of Kingston had found a second heartbeat in London, Birmingham, and Bristol. But beneath the bass lines and bright lights, cracks were starting to show. The same system that lifted British reggae into the spotlight was now squeezing the life out of it. Let's sit with that for a second. Behind every vinyl hit, there was exhaustion. The touring grind was endless. Small venues, little pay, constant travel. Bands like Aswad and Steel Pulse were running on fumes, juggling label demands and the need to stay true to their message. Radio wanted something lighter, friendlier, more pop. But reggae had never been built to smile for the cameras. It was protest music dressed in rhythm, quick reality check. Meanwhile, the mainstream had moved on. Pop was cleaner, MTV had arrived, and the major labels were chasing synth sounds. Reggae, especially the kind that spoke hard truths, didn't fit the new algorithm. For every crossover hit like UB40's Red Red Wine, there were 10 brilliant British reggae records that never got airplay, buried under the weight of industry gatekeeping. Here's the part fans don't put on t-shirts. Many of these artists were fighting battles far beyond the studio. There were family struggles, money splits, racism in the press, and creative burnout. Bands that had once stood united under one banner began splintering over direction and survival. Should they stay pure to the roots or lean into pop? Should they sing for radio or for revolution? That question tore some crews apart. Listen to how the tempo feels heavier now. The scene that had once thrived on community was now fragmented. Some turned to dub experimentation. Producers like Mad Professor and Dennis Bovell pushing the limits of sound, manipulating echo, space, and rhythm like painters with bass. Others leaned into the softness of lovers rock, carrying the genre into living rooms and top of the pops, even as critics dismissed it as too gentle. But that was innovation too, proof that British reggae could evolve without losing its soul. Hold that sound in your head. Now add politics. Outside the clubs, Britain was burning. The late 70s and early 80s brought unemployment, riots, and the rise of the National Front. Reggae became both shield and sword. Linton Kwesi Johnson turned poetry into weaponry, performing dub verse that hit harder than any headline. His words about police brutality, racism, and black identity cut through the air like fire. It wasn't background music, it was testimony, and that's the part the BBC's Reggae Britannia documentary only brushed against. The militant side, the anger, the defiance wasn't just an edge of the movement, it was the movement. Every bass note carried a piece of that resistance. But there's a price for staying defiant. Record labels grew wary. Some dropped their reggae rosters. Funding for festivals dried up. Pirate stations faced raids. Even within the community, creative exhaustion set in. Artists felt caught between authenticity and survival. Without mainstream backing, many acts struggled to keep touring or recording. The energy that once felt unstoppable began to scatter. And yet, innovation never died. British reggae refused to fade quietly. The 1980s became its golden era precisely because the scene learned to adapt. It fused with punk, funk, and eventually hip-hop. Dub became a laboratory for sound engineering that would later shape jungle, drum and bass, and dubstep. The roots were still there, they'd just grown underground, ready to rise again in new forms. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. British reggae wasn't just echoing Jamaica, it was answering it. It was reggae reimagined through the lens of black British life, of second-generation identity. This was the music of a people who belonged to two worlds and yet fully to neither. By the end of the 1980s, the golden era was dimming. Labels shifted focus, and newer genres began taking the stage. Some artists went solo, some faded away, and others, like UB40, chased pop success that brought both fame and criticism. For every moment of triumph, there was a question of cost. Because behind the posters, there was always a price tag, sleep, sanity, and sometimes the soul of the sound itself. Most scenes fade slowly, but British reggae didn't fade. It transformed, it fractured, rebuilt, and kept evolving in the shadows. Its pioneers may have struggled under the weight of industry and politics, but their innovations, those heavy bass lines, echoing dubs, and fierce lyrics became the DNA of modern British music. So when you hear grime, jungle, or even modern pop with that unmistakable low-end pulse, you're hearing the ghost of that golden era, the echo of an underground that refused to die. Beat. Next time, we'll look at how those echoes kept vibrating, how reggae's descendants carried the fire forward long after the original sound systems went silent. Because the story of reggae in Britain doesn't end with a fall. It ends with a rebirth.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. But check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
They say music dies when no one remembers where the beat came from, but with British reggae, memory never really let go. The rhythm kept bending, seeding new sounds, and turning up in places the originators never imagined. This final chapter is about that echo, how a handful of basements, sound systems, and stubborn people shaped music for generations, and why that story still matters today. Act 1, The Map of Influence. Think of influence as a map with lines that keep crossing. From lovers, rock to dub to roots, British reggae planted seeds everywhere. Bands like Steel Pulse and Aswad taught the nation how to write protest into melody. UB40 showed pop the power of a reggae groove. Producers in small UK studios twisted echo and space so wildly that dub became a production language other genres borrowed. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, major pop and punk acts were stealing more than ideas. They were borrowing attitudes. The Clash didn't just cover reggae songs, they translated reggae's rebellious English into punk's urgency. Two-tone bands mixed ska and punk and took anti-racist messaging into mainstream charts. Later, grime and UK hip-hop would inherit the low-end logic and the street-tough storytelling that reggae had been perfecting for decades. Spot the lineage. Hear a 2020s producer drop a bass line, and you'll trace it straight back to those early UK dub mixes, that one-note bass drone, that roomy reverb, that pull on the backbeat. Those are fingerprints you hear in jungle, in dubstep, and even in modern pop production. Act 2. Afterlife, how the scene stayed alive. Reggae's afterlife didn't look like a single monument. It was 1,000 small things, reissue labels, digging up forgotten 12 inches, pirate station archives, resurfacing in podcasts, tribute nights in clubs, and murals that turned concrete blocks into history lessons. The revival comes in fits and starts. Box sets, vinyl reprints, festival stages programmed with old and new names side by side. One sample you've heard 1,000 times, that deep, looping bass or an echo-drenched vocal shout. It's been lifted, chopped, and reimagined across genres. Producers in later decades sampled dub delays and lovers' rock melodies to give their tracks instant emotional weight. Reissues brought renewed respect to artists who once played for shillings and never saw proper credit. Quick reality check. Meanwhile, the fans kept the flame. From Brixton to Bristol, elders taught the kids which 45s mattered. DJs curated nights that were half ceremony, half classroom. That oral chain, this is the tune, this is why it means something, is how Forbidden Records became canonical. Act 3, why it still hits and why now. Why does reggae still move people who weren't alive for the first wave? For a 2025 listener, the sound carries things earlier audiences didn't expect. Cinematic production, political nuance, and a rawness that streaming-era music often lacks. Modern ears find depth in spaces older producers left on purpose. Where pop fills every second, classic reggae holds breath, and that silence speaks. Spot the lineage. Listen to a grime MC riding a sparse beat. The way they play around an empty bar owes a debt to reggae's one drop and to dub's love of space. Listen to a modern producer twisting delay on a vocal. There's a direct line back to Mad Professor's hands on the board. Gateway tracks to start today. Pick one warm doorway. For lovers rock, start with Janet Kay's Silly Games. For militant roots, play Linton Kwesi Johnson's spoken word renderings paired with dub mixes. For crossover pop with a clear reggae backbone, try UB40's Red Red Wine or Aswad's Don't Turn Around. These tracks give you the feel, the groove, and a window into the whole map. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. Legacy isn't only about who sells the most records, it's about who teaches the next generation how to feel rhythm as history. Young British artists across R&B, grime, electronic, and indie still work in a sonic language that reggae helped write. When they borrow that cadence or that bass approach, they aren't copying a style, they're conversing with a history. The Invite, your role in the story. Before Reggae Britannia, parts of Britain sounded one way. After it, whole swathes of British music began to wear its colors, sometimes proudly, sometimes subtly. If you were there, you remember the first time a bass line hit your chest and you felt seen. If you weren't, this is the invitation. Listen with a guide. One sample you've heard 1,000 times might be a hook in a song you streamed yesterday. Try to spot it, follow the echo. Put one of the gateway tracks in a playlist and let it lead you down a rabbit hole of reissues, interviews, and tribute mixes. Start with one record, then ask, where did this come from and who kept it alive? Okay, your pick goes in the pinned playlist. What was the first British reggae song that hit you in the chest? Which artist deserves a full deep dive next? Drop it in the comments. This history grows when we share memory. Before those sound systems packed halls, the scene sounded like home. After them, everyone chased that thing, the heavy bass, the patient space, the courage to speak. Even artists who never heard the name live in the echo. That's legacy. Unseen, uncredited, but everywhere. Subscribe so this history doesn't get erased by the algorithm. Hit the next episode where we trace one loud thread, the jump from lovers rock to modern UK R&B, and find the exact moment a soulful ballad turned into an urban anthem. If you enjoyed this deep cut, like the video and pin your gateway track in the comments. I'll collect the best picks into a community playlist and we'll use it to map the next deep dive. Music remembers. Let's remember with it.